Hello, writers. Today we're going to be going over the 3 ways to use sources in your writing: summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. I also want to briefly cover when you should cite. So I said on the first page, any type of source usage should be cited. So we know that we should cite quotations, but oftentimes students don't know that any information or ideas that came from a source should be cited, even if you put those ideas in your own word. Even if, as well, you learned it once upon a time. So maybe there was a class in high school where you learned a piece of information. If you didn't think of it originally, you still need to cite it unless it would qualify as common knowledge, something that just everybody knows sort of just through observation or, cultural knowledge types of things. So when should you summarize, and sort of what does the summary do? So the summary's job is to capture the source's overall argument about the topic. So it's going to be quite condensed and much shorter than the original because it's a summary. So you could have, for example, you could have a 10-page article. The summary could be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. So it's going to be very condensed because your goal is to convey the overall position of an author or a text. I really recommend that you include a brief summary the first time you introduce a new source into your paper, because your readers really need to know what the source is saying before you start to pull in quotations or before you start to talk about particular ideas. They need to understand the source before you pull little small things from that source. So whenever you first pull in a source in a research paper, I would give at least a couple sentence summary, and depending on the length or the type of paper, maybe even a short paragraph to summarize a source when you first pull it into your paper. You also want to note that a pure summary does not contain your opinion of the source. It's only representing what the source itself says. So a pure summary will remain completely objective rather than inserting your subjective take on the source. And of course, don't forget to cite when you summarize. So a really good guideline for how to write a short summary, and you will see posted on Classroom, is sort of a template for constructing a summary in this way with 3 columns. So in the first column there is the author and the info and the title and type of source. So the first thing you need to do in any summary is tell people what the thing is that you are summarizing. So here we have an example. It's color-coded over here. The book, Painless Public Speaking by Sharon Bauer, a speech professor at Yale. So here we even have a little bit of important information about the author, because that information helps your readers understand this source's credibility. Right? So we have the title of the book, we have the author, and then we have some key information about the author that's relevant, that's important. Then you choose a rhetorically accurate verb here. So here we have the book provides a number of practical tips, or the article argues, or the article suggests. So please do use the textbook to help you choose that rhetorically accurate verb, as well as, they give you some tips on how to do that. So, and then of course you want to capture the overall point the source is making. Now it's possible that you may need to write a longer summary. So depending on how you're using the source, how much of the source you're using, how heavily you're relying on the source, or the type of assignment, you may need to use a longer summary, which you will need to do for the paper that's coming up. You start with that short summary. So you use that 3-column system to build a short summary. And then in the next few sentences, you go play by play through the main points of the source. So it's a paraphrase of each of the author's major supporting points. There will probably be sort of 2 to 4, depending on the size of the article and how many points they are making. You want to try to capture each of the major supporting points. And so you may need a sentence, 2 sentences, maybe even 3 to do that. And then you're going to wrap up your longer summary by noting how the author concludes or what they suggest at the end. Who the audience and purpose can be part of the final sentence. So sort of overall, what do they want from us? Or who are they talking to? What do they suggest? What solutions do they offer? And usually you can find that in the conclusion. So this really is still part of the play-by-play. You want to make sure your summary is accurate, that you're not misrepresenting the text in any way. You also want to be thorough. You don't want to just summarize the first half and leave off a really important point. So the summary should sort of go through the whole article. And remember to remain objective. In a pure summary, you're not offering what you think on the topic or what you think of the source. It's purely what the source says and what the source does. Here's an example of a longer summary. The first sentence here, as you notice, provides the overall summary. We have the title listed, the author, some information about the author, and the overall thing that the source does. She notes, so notes here, it's not really sort of, a strong verb. It's more neutral. And then we have the play-by-play that begins here. First, she attributes the greater tolerance of law students to training. The play-by-play continues here. She emphasizes the importance. So notice the verb choice here. She attributes, she emphasizes, she notes. And then finally, how the author herself concludes. She laments the fact that civility has declined and urges that they return to values still in place within the legal community. So this is what she wants, right? She wants people to return to these important values. So this is a really nice example of a longer summary that begins with the one-sentence summary, gives a play-by-play, and then ends with how the author wraps it all up and concludes it in their original source essay. Now, paraphrasing is also important to this discussion because the play-by-plays here are sort of paraphrases because they're paraphrases in your own words of specific parts of the argument rather than the overall argument. So the textbook chapter does have some information about paraphrasing that is really important, but you use paraphrasing when you need to discuss a single fact, a single idea, a single supporting point in the original source. It's your own rendition of essential information from a source, of sort of a single piece of essential information. It's really important that a paraphrase is in your own words and also in your own style. You want to be really careful not to stick too close to the original wording because that's a type of plagiarism, actually, is unsuccessful paraphrasing, and we'll talk about that next. Don't forget as well, when you are paraphrasing, you do still need to cite the source. Even though you're putting a single idea in your own words, the idea still comes from the source. So if you don't cite it, you're sort of making your readers think that that idea came from you, when in fact it came from somebody else's hard work or, thoughts. Here is an example of a good paraphrase that you can take a look at, and I've also included a link to the OWL at Purdue's, up here, the OWL at Purdue's information on paraphrasing, which actually is really helpful. It's very short and to the point. And so if you're struggling to understand paraphrasing, you can check this out. But you can see in a legitimate paraphrase, everything is really in our own words. There's no sort of phrases that are exactly the same. And you will also see that it is cited in MLA format correctly as well. But paraphrasing is really important and helpful because it provides some context for your readers. It shows that you understand what you read. And because you're not quoting all the time from other sources, it helps you preserve your own voice because you are saying somebody else's ideas, but in your own words. And so more parts of the paper are going to sound like you as opposed to just overloading the paper with quotations. It really shows that you understand the sources that you're working with, which builds your own credibility for your readers. Now let's talk about problematic paraphrasing, and one of the most problematic ways of paraphrasing we call patch writing. Phrases that are too close to the original. It's basically plagiarism. Teens are widely recognized becomes teenagers are generally recognized. We've just patched in generally on top of widely, but the phrasing is still exactly the same. We just swapped out one word. As an important consumer group, as an influential consumer group, right? So we have influential replaced by important. So we just patched in one word, way too close to the original. So it doesn't really count as paraphrasing. We call that patch writing. And, in some circumstances, depending on the severity, it could be considered a form of plagiarism. So we definitely want to avoid it. So to avoid plagiarism, remember always to cite the author. If you do use any borrowed phrases, remember to put quotation marks around it, and don't follow the original structure too closely. You want to make sure it's in your own words and style. So what I recommend is if you want to put something in your own words, read it carefully, digest it, and then close the book or close the window of the source. And then give yourself a second and really think about what they're talking about and try to type it out without looking back at the source. Because if you're looking too closely at it, you're more likely to rephrase in exactly the same way, just swapping out a few words here and there. And then open it back up and check, double check to make sure you've really captured it accurately, but it is still in your own words and style. And then also, of course, don't forget to cite the author, even though it's a paraphrase.